Good morning, and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System. This automated train is provided for the security and convenience of the Black Mesa Research Facility personnel. The time is 8:47 a.m. Current topside temperature is 93 degrees, with an estimated high of 105. The Black Mesa compound is maintained at a pleasant 68 degrees at all times.
Alright, let's begin the ride down.
Yup, all the way from ethnic self-segregation down to
This train
hormones and
is
whatever.
inbound from Level 3 dormitories to Sector C test labs
Are you ready
and
to delve
control
into this?
facilities. If your
Alright,
intended
let's go down.
destination is a high security area beyond Sector
Mostly
C,
ethnic
you will
self-segregation
need to
down
return
here.
to the central transit hub in Area 9.
Now, I've decided the evidence I will provide you into two main categories. One that I've labeled affectional-leaning evidence, referring to the idea of cause and effect, where correlation does not mean causation, but which still serves as an illustrative point of how these social effects aren't necessarily caused by nature, but at least show the prevalence of racism. So what I'm showing you so far could simply be the after effects of the nasty idea of racism. It does not imply that racism is innate. In other words, these particular evidence does not really prove the case, or to use an English phrase, they do not put the final nails in the coffin, so to speak. However, nor do they prove that racism is not innate. It's important to remember that. So what is the purpose? What does it do? It does imply that there is a deep-seated problem, which implicitly show, on some levels, the so-called racist ideas, or the biological phenomenon's immutability. And by emphasizing the problems of the immutability of racism, and the social consequences by denying its level of immutability, I have at least made a case that this is a topic worthy of our attention and reflection. As most of my viewers are well aware of the social problems caused by denying man's tribal nature, you might already be familiar with a lot of what I will introduce to you here. However, stick around. There might be some tasty treats left for you in the bowl, some information you haven't yet stumbled upon. The other main category I've decided to label causational-leaning evidence, referring to the type of evidence and theories that I will provide you here. I can imagine that this will be the most interesting type of information to people, and also the most educational type of information, which most of you haven't acquired yet. This will be the type of evidence that more likely than not will seal the deal, and put the final nail in the coffin. Alright, under the first main category, we have subcategory number 1. I will here deal with ethnic self-segregation in cities, in schools, to illustrate that we are implicitly and unconsciously acting on something, quite consistently, that ensure that we self-segregate ourselves. Is this an idea in the back of our mind, or are we acting on our human nature without much thought?
You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Long thought to be the stuff of textbook and historical documentaries, public school segregation is still a growing problem around the country, as well as here in Minnesota. Reporter A.J. Holler is here to share his recent conversation on the subject with noted expert Myron Orfield.
He says that many of the efforts to desegregate schools that you saw in the 60s and 70s have fallen by the wayside, and efforts to reverse this trend are proving difficult.
School segregation was thought to have been eliminated a long time ago.
Both the civil rights movement and the Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus Board of Education were thought to have ended the separation of whites and non-whites in the classroom. But according to University of Minnesota law professor Myron Orfield, schools in Minnesota are now more segregated than ever.
And now it's more segregated than it's ever been in our schools. And this Minneapolis is an example. In 1995, there were about 5 or 6 segregated schools, maybe as many as 9. Now there's 110 segregated schools.
While the charter school movement's growing, some concerns are being raised about the system. A new study by UCLA's Civil Rights Project suggests charter school growth is increasing classroom segregation. 7 out of 10 black charter school students attend schools with extremely low numbers of white students.
Basically, what we find is that although public schools have become much more segregated since the Supreme Court changed the law in the 1990s, charter schools are vastly more segregated than that, and that it's segregation not just by race but also by poverty, and that there are not only segregated black schools and some segregated Latino schools, but there's also segregated white schools that overrepresent whites in some states, including California, and some of which appear to have no free lunch facilities. So basically the system of choice that's used here doesn't have the civil rights protections that good magnet schools have, for example. And for black students, particularly in the East and the Middle West, there is a heavy concentration in central cities. But the charters are even more segregated than the public schools there. And charters aren't limited by district boundaries the way public schools are. They could draw students from across city suburban boundary lines, for example.
Take a look around. You don't need a microscope to see. In fact, it is quite evident that people are separating themselves by race.
I know for a lot of people, self-segregation can be, I guess, negative. But for me, I look at it as people who are comfortable being around people who are like themselves. And sometimes it may be because they are the same race or same ethnicity.
It's just like where students will segregate themselves into different classes based on race or age and stuff like that.
Sometimes it's even the same gender, but they are just more comfortable with people who maybe look like them, act like them, talk like them, think like them, and so they don't get out of their comfort zone.
I suppose the simplest form is would be just wanting to be around people who are most like you.
Is when a group of people segregate themselves by race and things they have in common.
I'm comfortable around my own race, I'd have to say that. Probably because I know that a lot of them relate to me better than other people can.
Yes, most likely, yes, I am comfortable around my own race. Because, like you said, just a similar interest in things you could do together.
We have a story here tonight about a very controversial plan that its advocates say will make schools better for minority children in one American city. And it involves a new law that seems to be turning back the clock. Half a century after public schools in this nation were desegregated and the idea of separate but equal was thrown out by the U.S. Supreme Court, this new plan in Omaha, Nebraska deliberately resegregates that city's schools. And there's an interesting figure leading this fight. The story from NBC's Kevin Tibbles.
The new law has many in Omaha wondering if the public schools their children attend are going back in time.
Segregation exists right now.
And this Nebraska state senator is behind it all. Ernie Chambers says Omaha is already divided economically, socially, racially.
The gap between the achievement of white children and black children in their respective schools is not narrowing.
So Chambers says, why not allow each group to control its children's education? And split the school board into 3 districts. Under one scenario, one would be 70% white, another 57% black, a third 40% Latino.
Well, you know, alternative schools are about choice. It's open to any student who wants to learn a little bit more about African people's heritage, their language, their culture, their ways, their customs, and of course their experiences. African-centered learning centers the learner around African people's history, their values, their knowledge, and their culture. So that spans the continent of Africa. It talks about people in the Caribbean, people in Southern America, even people in Europe, and as well, of course, right here in the Canadian context. So our children will not only be learning just about Canada, but they'll be learning about African people wherever they are in the world.
Americans are divided by race. They will continue to be divided by race. A year ago, when he was elected, people were talking about him as if he were Gandhi or Jesus. There was this paroxysm of joy that somehow a miracle was going to take place. And I think people thought of him in terms of a miracle because they know that race and racial problems have been the worst problem for the United States ever since even before it was a country. Even blacks who described themselves as conservatives voted for Barack Obama out of racial solidarity.
And I want to ask you, did race play a factor in who you voted for?
Yes, it did.
So race made a difference in deciding
who you voted for? It did make a difference. It did make a difference for me. Yes, it did.
And most people said Barack Obama. So what he said is, do you support Obama's views? But he attributed all of McCain's views to Obama.
Yes. And it didn't
sway anyone.
But it didn't cause people to even flinch. They went right along.
This is crazy. So listen to this.
No, so you think you made the right choice on that? I definitely do. Thank you very much, sir. Have a great day.
So the guy agreed with everything McCain is for, except he said it was for Obama. Here's another example.
You know who you never hear about when they talk about racism during the election? You never hear about the 90% of African Americans who are voting for Barack Obama. You never hear about them. This isn't 90% of African Americans who had an arduous task over the last year, who looked at both candidates and now have decided to vote for Barack Obama. No, you're talking about 90% of African Americans who've been voting for Barack Obama since day one, since before he even opened his mouth, since before Barack Obama even uttered a word. He had 90% of the African American vote, and nobody sees racism yet. Are you kidding me? That's the exact definition of racism. You're voting for somebody solely based on their race.
If, and this is a big if a lot of these kids voted for him strictly because he's black, not really taking into account his other merits, the question is, are they racist?
Well, no.
No.
There were a lot of black folks that voted for him just because he was black.
Yeah.
And I think I think it's problematic.
Like, people support him? Yeah, but I think it's for the wrong reasons. Talk to me about that. What do you think they support him for? You think he's black? Okay. Because he's black. I mean, well, okay, let's put it like, you know what I mean? This guy's real. This guy's...
If whites voted out of race the same way, we would have had a white president. I think that many whites, among the whites who voted for them, many of them voted for a black candidate so that they could pat themselves on the back and say, I'm not racist, look at me. And also in this hope that somehow this was going to be a miracle that was going to solve America's worst problem. And of course that was a delusion.
Not necessarily. I forgot that he was black. Well, how do you forget that he's black? That's a black man standing in front of you. Don't ever forget that.
Jared, go ahead.
Oh, well, great. Now you're saying so long as people have a race, we must have that constantly in our minds all the time, every moment we have our eyes on a person, we've got to think, that man's black, that man's black.
Absolutely.
No, what he's saying is
absolutely.
Barack Obama has set race aside. Hold on.
It's important to appreciate people's cultures.
Now that's post-racial?
Yes.
Wait a minute. Oh, appreciate their culture.
Yes,
look,
absolutely,
all he's saying is this guy, hold on, let me finish.
It's part of respect for people's histories.
All he's saying. Well, I think back to this question of post-racial, I'm quite intrigued by Ms. Hernandez's view that whenever we're speaking or observing a black person or perhaps a Hispanic or an Asian, we are constantly to be thinking in terms of, oh my gosh, this person is not like me, he's of a different race. We will never get post-racial, but perhaps she's being realistic. Perhaps she's pointing out something that is a basic part of human nature, that people are always aware of race and that it is impossible to transcend race. Perhaps she's right about that.
Jared, go ahead.
Now you're making all sorts of distinctions here. We have to be conscious of race, we have to consider their background, we have to consider their history, we have to respect them, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to know anything in particular about them as to what they're going to say or what they're going to do. This is a lot of work.
Correct.
And if this is required of every individual in every multiracial, hold on. Yes, if this is required of every human being in every multiracial society, no going to be a success. In Britain, you find exactly the same thing, constant conflict between Asians, blacks, whites. In Nigeria, I believe Mr. Aka is originally from Nigeria, you had a tribal war. Wherever you have differences of race, religion, ethnicity, you have conflict of this kind. And to say, okay, we will just need to have to respect each other and all the problems will go away, that's naive.